Hello everyone, this is China Euro Academy. I'm Frances Wood, and for more than 30 years I was very happy to work in the British Library looking after the Chinese books and manuscripts that formed part of the British Library collections. I should explain perhaps that the British Library was only formed in 1972. Previously it had been part of the British Museum. It had been the central department of the museum, and that was founded in 1753. In 1753, the British nation, as it were, gathered together some private collectors, objects, books, manuscripts and so on, and formed the British Museum. The most important of these collectors was Sir Hans Sloane, who left 71,000 objects, that's including books and manuscripts, and they became part of the British Museum, what we call the founding collections. He had been a doctor, he had been doctor to Queen Anne, who, when I told my mother this, she was very shocked because Queen Anne had something like 11 children, all of whom died. So she said Sloane must have been a very bad doctor. But in fact, he looked after her only in old age. He started collecting himself when he was working in Jamaica, and he amassed collections of natural history, books, manuscripts, all sorts of things, and they formed the British Museum. Now, one of the people who supplied Sloane with books and objects from the Far East was a man called James Cunningham. You have to think, in the mid-18th century, in 1753 and before that, when Sloane was collecting, there was no one in the UK who knew any Chinese. Nobody knew anything about China, but there were people working for the British East India Company who were making the trip to Guangzhou and then up sometimes to Zhoushan, to the Zhoushan archipelago, and they brought items back. Now, James Cunningham, he collected plants. There's a very nice tree that's named after him, which grows in China, Cunninghamia lanceolata, and he sent back objects to Sloane and to Petiver, who was another collector, a famous collector in the UK at the time. This is a letter which Cunningham wrote to Sloane. It's in the British Library's collection relating to Sloane, and you can see it says that it's from Zhoushan, that's Zhoushan, and it's just dated between 1703 to 4 because he wrote it around Chinese New Year, so he didn't know quite which year he was writing in. And he says in it that he's sending him a box of shells for Mr. Petiver and a book of paintings of Chinese plants, and most importantly for the British Library, he says, I'm sending you a Chinese common prayer book and a guide to the island of Putoshan, which is one of my favourite items in the British Library collections. This is possibly Cunningham's Book of Plants. This is a collection of plant paintings with names. They often have the characters and they have the names written probably in Xiamen dialect. And beside it, the tree that you can see, that is Cunninghamia lanceolata, the tree that was named after James Cunningham, who discovered it first in China. But the description of Puto in Chinese, as I say, this is one of my favourite items in the collection. It's a very crudely produced little book. It's not beautifully printed. It's very much a sort of guidebook. If you went to Putoshan, you would buy it so that you could find your way to all the temples as you went up the mountain. It's probably late Ming, very early Qing, and it's probably the only surviving example of this guidebook. And here I think there's an interesting difference between China and Europe in the way that we look at old Chinese books. In Europe, what's most important is for something to be rare. That's our highest category. A rare book means there are hardly any other examples. Or maybe this is a guban, an individual item, the only survivor. I think that's probably true of this Putoshan guidebook. But for Chinese librarians, it's much more important that quality comes into the description. In China, they don't say rare book, you say shanban, which means really a good book, a fine edition. And so when I used to show this to visiting librarians from China, from the National Library, they would look rather horrified that I would consider this an important item. So there's a difference in the way that we look at these items. But for me, this is a very important surviving piece of popular printing, the sort of thing that you would have found all over China, which ordinary people would have used, but nobody thought to keep. So it's only survived in the British Library, really by chance. Now, because Sloane was a doctor, many of the books that he had in his collection related to medicine. We've discovered that he probably had about 60 different Chinese books, which is quite a lot if you consider, as I say, that nobody in England at the time knew how to speak or read Chinese. But he had quite a number of medical books. And one of the things that is interesting in pursuing Sloane's collection is that the way that we can identify a book as having belonged to Sloane, one is you can see the stamp at the bottom where it says Museum Britannicum in Latin. A square stamp in black tends to indicate that a book was originally in Sloane's collection. So it's one of the founding collection pieces in the library. So there you can see the title page, which again has the stamp of Sloane's Materia Medica. It's possible too that the notes in it that you can see here in Latin were written by Sir Thomas Hyde, who was, at that time, he was the interpreter in foreign languages to the King of England. We'll come back to Hyde a little bit later. But this, I think it's very interesting that Sloane has a Bensao, the Bensao Gangmu. It's very soon after its publication. You know, it would have been still quite a new and important book. But another sign that it belonged to Sloane is if you look underneath the Latin, you can just see PROR 31. And PR stands for printed, Yinshua. OR stands for Oriental, Dongya, whatever. So this shows that it was in Sloane's collection and identified as a printed Oriental book. Other medical works in his collection include this one, which again has the PROR note. Here's his Bensao. This is the sort of opening that we would use to show Europeans because it's got these charming animal pictures. And here another book of medicine, as you can see there. He also had quite a number of Li Shu almanacs, you know, which would be produced every year at the beginning of the Chinese New Year and sent out all over the country. And Sloane has half a dozen of these in his collection, which must have been bought probably, as this one says, brought from Canton. So maybe a ship's captain, people on an East India ship were in Guangzhou at the New Year when the new almanac is issued, and they bought this because they would see it being sold everywhere on the streets, and they brought it back to England as a curiosity. Here's another, as you can see, which originally was in somebody else's collection. We think it might have been in the Hyde collection, so had close contact with the English king. And yet another. This is beginning of this almanac for the year 1736, which begins in February. You can see that all the English people who collected these books were fascinated by the fact that the Chinese New Year began at the wrong time for them. Sloane also had in his collection several editions of this Jesuit publication produced in Peking, 1671. As you must know, the Jesuits were employed in the courts by Kangxi and Qianlong, particularly as astronomers. So anything to do with the heavens interested them greatly, and they were trained in astronomy to go out to China and help with the calendar and with what was happening in the skies. And they produced these. This is an edition which is in Chinese and Manchu, so you can see that it was produced for the court, specifically for the Manchu emperors of the time. Sloane has 2 copies of this, and here is the title page of another one, which is particularly interesting in that you can see the notes that are written beside the title. These are written by Sir Thomas Hyde, who was the interpreter to the King of England, with the help of Shen Fuzong, who was one of the first Chinese to come to England, brought along by a missionary, Couplay, a French Jesuit missionary. He brought Shen Fuzong to Europe, and Shen Fuzong, as a sort of curiosity, was introduced to the King of England. Then he went on and met the King of France, and whilst he was in England, he gave Thomas Hyde, the royal interpreter, lessons in Chinese, which still exist, little scribbled pages in the British Library. You can see there where he's written 四书 and then 中国原始 and so on. All these bits and pieces that have been written by Shen Fuzong to help Sir Thomas Hyde, who was the royal interpreter, understand Chinese and understand a little bit more about the Chinese books in his collection and in the collection of Sloane. And there in the centre is a very famous portrait of Shen Fuzong, which James II, King James, had made by his official court painter, Kneller, and it's said that it hung outside the king's bedroom. He was very fond of Shen Fuzong and very interested in him. The portrait of Shen Fuzong, who was a Chinese Jesuit. He had been brought to Europe by Couplay, who was a Chinese Jesuit missionary, a French Chinese Jesuit missionary in China, and he brought Shen Fuzong, a young Chinese who had learnt Latin and was therefore able to communicate in Latin with people like Thomas Hyde. So Shen Fuzong came to England before he went on to France, and he met the king, who was very impressed with him and remembered him quite clearly. He said, he was a little blinking fellow, was he not? All of that is recorded. And Shen Fuzong taught Hyde Chinese, and the lessons that they had, in which Shen Fuzong wrote down Chinese characters. He draws a picture of the abacus, the swanpan, and various other things, and he teaches Hyde how to write Chinese characters. Where you see here on that red strip, obviously the characters there have been written by Shen Fuzong. They're very nicely written. I think above you can see 四书 has been written by Hyde. It's really rather clumsy and written with an English pen. But you also see beside, in the red strip, beside the characters, you've got a kind of version of pinyin, a kind of pronunciation table. It's not very easy, and it's probably very southern Chinese, and also they're kind of inventing a romanization system. But this is how Shen Fuzong and Hyde talked to each other in Latin and learnt a certain amount of Chinese. So Shen Fuzong can be credited with teaching Hyde Chinese, enabling Hyde to look at the books in the Chinese collection and make something of them, and also books in the royal collection. There were 1 or 2 Chinese books collected by the English kings. So Shen Fuzong is a very, very key character. He went on off to France. That was his main objective with Couplay. And not so much is known about him. There's quite a lot recording his trip in England. He visited Oxford, and which was where Hyde worked, and so he was quite well known in royal circles in the UK in that period, just at the end of the 17th century. James Cunningham mentioned sending books about Christianity that were produced by the Jesuits in China, and this is definitely one of them. As you can see, it has the Sloane stamp and the PROR marking, so we know that this must have been the book that came all the way from Putoshan with James Cunningham to Sloane in England. There was quite a few more books in the Sloane collection which were produced by the Jesuits in China about Christianity at the time. And the famous, they called it the Brevis Relatio of 1701, which was a Jesuit work on Kangxi's Edict of Tolerance, the whole question of the toleration, the allowing missionaries to come into China was discussed by the Kangxi Emperor. But the interesting thing to me about Sloane's collection of more than 60 Chinese books, as I say, compiled at a time when no one in England knew Chinese, is that he had an extraordinary span of works, not just the things that Cunningham had given him, the Jesuit publications, which would have been quite widely available, but he also had, for example, a Buddhist work that you can see here. So late Ming Buddhist printing in the standard long format and a blue cover, very typical of Chinese printing at the time. He also had a Taoist work, the Ganyingbian, which is a lovely example, which you can see with the illustrations. This is a very useful illustration to show people in the UK about how dreams are depicted in Chinese books. And I love it, the way that the man is asleep at his desk and then you can see the dream coming out of his head and there is the content of his dream. It's a very good sort of cartoony depiction of dreams. But it's interesting, that Sloane has Taoist, Christian and Buddhist works. He also has a Sishu, so he has got rather poor. This is definitely not a Shanben in the Chinese sense, a rather poor locally produced copy of the 4 books. And the Shijing too, classic of poetry, there, again in a very crudely produced edition, but the illustration has considerable charm today. He had literature, and this is a very famous example of the Sangguo, which was printed in 1592. And we are lucky in the British Library to have 2 volumes of it, including the colophon, which you can see there, with the lotus leaf on top and the lotus flowers below. So that gives you the date of production. But it's interesting that this particular edition of the Sangguo was probably bought in Amsterdam in about 1600. We know that the copies were sold there, and the book was divided up. If you think it consisted of many zhuan, and you've got 2 in the British Library, there are 1 or 2 in the library in Oxford, 1 or 2 in Cambridge, and some in Germany. So the sellers had no idea that this was one work. They thought, oh, it's lots of little Chinese books, and sold them separately. So they had no understanding of the actual content of the work, but people were interested in buying it nevertheless. And we know that it was in England in 1657 because it was used in the very famous Polyglot Bible, which was produced in that year. And it may be that the book was at the time in the possession of Hyde, because he had a lot to do with the Polyglot Bible. The Polyglot Bible is a version of the Bible which includes the many different languages which formed the original Bible, Aramaic, Hebrew, and so on. And it also included specimens of writing from all over the world, just to show the amazing variety of languages that there were, even though they'd got nothing to do with the Bible itself. And here you can see that the book that finally comes into Sloane's library is in the UK in 1657 and used as an example of Chinese printing at that time. Sloane also had a dictionary, as you can see here. This is a fairly simple dictionary, not of any great kind of interest, but still it's important that he had a dictionary. You can see the different strokes there. He had a book on calligraphy, which you can see has been reclassified in his library several times. Here is the title. It's a wonderful title, The Collection of the Dancing Swords. And it's got a note there from Thomas Hyde, who's obviously looked at it. And here you can see some pages from the book itself. Again, it's not a very remarkable book in itself, but it is just interesting that it's made its way to the UK and formed part of the early British Museum collection. There you can see fish writing, bird writing, all sorts of different... These are familiar to many Chinese people and still, sometimes used today for decorative calligraphy. He also had a book on how to draw and paint, which again, it's a fairly common item, but the fact that it's in Sloane's collection is what is interesting to me. And it's quite nicely illustrated, but you can see it's printed on rather poor paper. It's not a fine edition in any way. But it shows you how to write, how to put pieces together, to paint a nice picture of Narcissus and plum blossom, and then how to do the individual bits of the plum blossom. This is something that's of great interest to people in the UK who are very interested in the construction of Chinese painting. And I'm very fond of, these are my two favourite pages, I think. I love the way that you have a picture, you have an illustration. There is Chang'e gazing at the moon with her, holding her rabbit in her arms, and she's standing underneath a banana leaf. And then you've got the characters for banana, as if you couldn't recognise it. And then beside it, there's the picture of a water buffalo ploughing, and it says, there it is, you've got a ploughing water buffalo, willow, and so on. I love the combination of characters and pictures. Now, the British Museum founded in 1753, but there was nobody who could look after any of the Oriental books at all. And it wasn't until 1769 that a chance encounter happened, and a man who was known by various names, Chetkwa Chitkwa, just a kind of Cantonese, some kind of Guangdonghua for his name. He was brought to England by the East India Company, and he was basically what he did. He was an artist who made little clay models. You can see beneath him in the portrait of him, but beneath him are two of his little clay portraits. He made portraits of significant people. He'd done it in India, where he was taken by the East India Company, and they brought him to England, where again he made these little modelled, they're tiny little pieces, little miniature portraits of famous Englishmen at the time, mostly medical in this case. And Chetkwa was invited to look at the Chinese books in the British Museum collection. Now, this was probably quite a difficult task for him. We don't know how literate he was. He might not have been very familiar with literature. And indeed, the poor man was anyway confronted with Japanese and Chinese books muddled together, which he did find very difficult. You couldn't really expect him to know Japanese. But since no one in the British Museum knew the difference between China and Japan, he was faced with them. And so some of the books, particularly in the Japanese collections, do have some quite funny descriptions where Chetkwa is trying to work out what the book is about. With the Chinese books, it was all right. They were fairly simple. But so you could call him, he's the first cataloguer of the Chinese books in the British Museum collection. But he really was not a specialist. But when he looked at books like the one you can see beside, these vocabularies, which are illustrated, of course it was fairly easy for him to do. Sloane's was the major collection in the British Museum at the beginning, and the major collection of Chinese books. But it's interesting to note that the other founding collections were also included a number of Chinese items, far fewer, and they're not nearly so important. But still, it demonstrates that in 17th and 18th century England, noblemen who were making collections of books did feel it important to have a Chinese book or two as a sort of example of Chinese printing, manuscript, whatever. And Robert Cotton his collection came into the museum as well. You can see he's died some time before, but his collection had been left to the nation, and it eventually finds its way into the British Museum in 1753. But he had very, very significant books, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and 2 copies of the Magna Carta, and so on. So he's a very significant collector of European manuscripts. But he also had one very tiny Chinese manuscript book, a book of short popular stories. And in the Harleyan collection of the 2 Earls of Oxford, Robert Harley and his son, Edward Harley, there were also a very small number of Chinese works. These included this one, which is rather fun, this kind of just collection of Confucius's sayings, which is inscribed, it says, "Given to my lord," Edward Harley, by a man called Michael Mater, and he says that it's volume 1, and it has these very charming illustrations. So, I mean, the British Library collection of early Chinese books, of late Ming, early Qing pieces, is really quite strong, and strong in illustrated works. I think this is something that's important, because the foreigners who were buying Chinese books in China in the 17th and 18th century obviously preferred books that had pictures in, for obvious reasons, since they didn't know which way the books went, they couldn't read any of the characters. And I think that illustration was fantastically important to them. We know that by 1753 there was a considerable collection of Chinese books and manuscripts in the British Museum, to the point that in 1781 it's recorded in the archives of the museum that a man called Mr. Penny offered the museum 5 Chinese books in 24 volumes for £30. And these were not taken into the collection because the museum says we have enough Chinese books to be produced as specimens. So this again, at this time, it reveals that the books were not, they couldn't be read, there was nobody who understood them and who could read them. So they were there as just examples, if you like, specimens of Chinese writing. But in the middle of the 19th century, there was a bit of a flurry of interest in the books in the British Museum. The librarian Antonio Panizzi, who came over as a refugee from Italy, he was a revolutionary, and in fact the Italian police wanted him. He had joined Garibaldi's Red Shirts and was being sought by the police in Italy. He fled to England and eventually, which is a fairly extraordinary story, became the head librarian in the British Museum. And he was an incredibly important man. He really made a system within the library. He reorganised copyright deposit, by which any book published in the UK the publisher should deposit 1 copy with the library so that a complete record of publication was kept. And Panizzi also was very aware of what was going on in other European collections, and he felt that he wanted to keep the British collection in the British Museum up to scratch. And in the middle of the 19th century, the library was offered a large collection of popular fiction, Ming-Qing xiaoshuo, and he spent quite a lot of money acquiring this collection, which is still of considerable interest to Chinese librarians today. Very early on, microfilms were made and sent to China because, again, this illustrated fiction is fairly rare in China, but it's survived outside because it's rather cheap and poorly produced, so it doesn't count as shanben, but Europeans liked it, particularly for the illustrations, and so Panizzi was prepared to spend a large sum of money in the mid-19th century in purchasing this particular collection. And he also appointed someone to catalogue the Chinese books between 1843 and 1858. And this was the first attempt made to catalogue the Chinese books in the British Library. They'd been there since, many of them, since 1753. Nothing had happened to them for nearly 100 years, but finally Panizzi was aware of their importance and decided to devote time and money to their cataloguing. And then in 1910, perhaps one of the most significant collections was brought into the British Museum, and that was the collection made in Dunhuang and other areas around Dunhuang, Tuofan, that area, by Sir Aurel Stein, who had been prospecting in the area, and he brought back innumerable treasures. He brought back over 24,000 manuscripts from Dunhuang, and they arrived, most of them arrived in London in 1910, and those mark a very significant departure to the collections that we'd had before. The Chinese collection in the British Museum was enormously changed by an arrival in 1910, when Sir Aurel Stein brought back the enormous number of manuscripts that he had found in Dunhuang. Aurel Stein was originally, he was a Hungarian who had studied in Germany. He had studied Sanskrit, and he went to work in India for the British government in India in the education department. But his personal passion was collecting manuscripts, particularly Sanskrit manuscripts. But when he was working in India, in Kashmir, he heard about all sorts of discoveries that were being made along the Silk Road, which was reached from that end of India, if you like. And he launched, in the end, throughout his life, 4 expeditions into the Silk Road areas of China. And on his second expedition in particular, he went to Dunhuang, the caves of Dunhuang, and there discovered the enormous cache of manuscripts that we know today as the Dunhuang manuscripts. And he came back from Dunhuang, arriving in 1910 in London, with certainly more than 17,000 Chinese manuscripts. There were also Tibetan manuscripts in Kharoshthi and various other languages. But the Chinese manuscripts were the most important. Now, Stein didn't know Chinese, thus continuing the great tradition in the British Museum of people working with Chinese things but not knowing them. But he took with him a Chinese helper who was able to help him to some extent with finding out what he'd got. But one of the most interesting things is that Stein, when he was in the cave in Dunhuang, he managed to collect a copy of the Jingangjing, the Diamond Sutra, which is the world's earliest securely dated printed book. And in this slide, at the bottom of the central picture, with that awful stain across it, you can see this is a picture of the Diamond Sutra when it arrived in London in 1910. And it tells us an enormous amount about Dunhuang and Cave 17 there. The other items that you can see include a wonderful manuscript across the top, which is complete with a silk tie, and then below it a little piece of printing, a printed prayer sheet, and beside that you have an example of rubbing, a rubbing from a large stele which has been cut down and made into a little notebook. These are pieces of huge importance to the history of printing and book production in China. And the Diamond Sutra at the bottom is obviously the most important. You can see there that the Diamond Sutra is in very poor condition. It has that big stain across the frontispiece, and you can see where it's rolled up, you can see there are patches on the back. So obviously, and also the top and bottom are quite ragged. So this is clearly a piece of printing which has had its day. It's no longer really to be used. There are many arguments about Cave 17 in Dunhuang. a little cave that was discovered in 1900, which had been sealed up, locked away for more than 1,000 years. And some people call it the cave library, but that's ridiculous. It can't have been a library. It wasn't, because it was full of manuscripts and a very small number of printed items that were past their prime, that were no good in some way. I mean, you have some wonderful manuscripts, but say it's a copy of the Lotus Sutra, Yanhua Jing, but it's missing 2 rolls, or it's torn at the beginning, or it's been patched, like this Diamond Sutra. The Diamond Sutra has been patched many times and has now been water-stained. So I think what is clear is that Cave 17 at Dunhuang was not a library, was not a working library. It was a sort of tomb. It was a place where you put very beautiful and wonderful things that had just, as it were, died. They couldn't be used any longer, but you couldn't just burn them or throw them away because they were religious texts. They had to be piously looked after. So they're put into this little dark cave and stored forever. So it's a sort of tomb of manuscripts. And I think that is very evident from the condition of the Diamond Sutra when you see it there. I mean, the Diamond Sutra has since been conserved over a period of about 7 years, and it is now in wonderful condition, as you can see later, and as you can occasionally see in the British Library. Work on the Dunhuang manuscripts began in 1910 when they arrived in London, and continues to this day to try and keep them in the best possible order and make them available to people all over the world. One of the most important things that has been carried out recently has been to take digital photographs of all the items in the collection and put them up on the web so that people, particularly in China, because after all we're talking about Chinese history, Chinese culture, a vast manuscript archive taken from China and which is of most interest to people in China. People can now look on the web and see these things in very clear and wonderful photographs and can scroll through a manuscript on their computer almost as if they were handling it in the British Library. Stein himself made 2 further expeditions to China and brought back many more artifacts. On his last expedition in the 1930s, he was finally stopped from taking things away from China. The government of China finally enacted regulations saying that people could not take stuff out of China willy-nilly. And there was a big outcry in Peking amongst intellectuals to stop artifacts leaving China. So finally Stein was stopped, as it were, and stopped from taking things out of the country, which obviously is very important for Chinese culture and for the Chinese study of history in China. The books in the Sloane collection and the other early items that came into the beginnings of the British Museum can all be seen in the British Library. The library is not a lending library, you can't borrow them, but you can see them in the library's reading rooms. And really anyone who has an interest in reading these early Chinese books or looking at them can apply for a reader's ticket. There's no particular restriction. If you know what you want to see, you know that it's in the Sloane collection, it's in the British Library, you can't see it anywhere else, then you can apply for a reader's ticket. All you need is proof of, I think, proof of your address. 2 forms of identity, one of which is proof of address, which for Chinese people you can use your 身份证 if you've got it. That's because it gives your address. Passports don't always give an address. And then you can go into the reading rooms, order the books and look at them. It's not an open shelf library, so you don't pick them off the shelves yourself. You have to order through the ordering system. But these books are there for anyone to see, anyone who's serious, wants to look at these books, then you're very welcome to use them in the British Library. It's slightly different for Dunhuang manuscripts, which are restricted, and we ask that people give a really serious evidence of the need to see an original, preferring them to look at either microfilms or published versions or digitized versions on the web, if possible. But if there is a compelling reason for you to see the original, then you can make that argument, and you may well be able to see the Dunhuang materials for yourself in the reading rooms, but they are restricted. That's only a brief introduction to some of the earliest Chinese books to come to the UK, and to show you how they got into the British Museum, where they are now in the British Library, and to welcome readers who want to consult the originals. And I think if you have any further queries or want to initiate any form of discussion, then please do get in touch with the China Europe Academy.